The outpost smelled like burnt oil and old metal. Waypoint 7 was not the kind of place anyone wanted to stay too long. It sat at the far edge of neutral space, where the galactic trade routes got thin and the crowds got rough. Ships came and went at all hours. Deals were made in back corners. Nobody asked too many questions, and nobody really wanted to know the answers. Cal Durham had been to Waypoint 7 4 times before, and every time he left feeling like he needed a long shower. He was a cargo hauler, nothing fancy, nothing glamorous. Just a man with a decent ship, a good work ethic, and a habit of keeping his nose clean. He was 38 years old, broad in the shoulders, and had the kind of face that looked like it had seen a few hard years but had come through mostly okay. His co-pilot, Lena Price, walked 2 steps behind him as they moved through the lower market district of the outpost. She was sharp-eyed and quick with words, the sort of person who noticed everything and said exactly what she thought about it. She had been flying with Cal for 3 years, and she trusted him about as much as she trusted anyone. They had just finished unloading a shipment of medical cargo, vaccines and surgical tools for a small colony 2 systems over. It had been a clean job, good pay, and now they had a few hours before their next pickup. Cal was thinking about finding a hot meal. Lena was thinking about finding a better card game than the one she had lost last night. That was when Cal stopped walking. Lena nearly ran into his back. She stepped to the side and followed his gaze, ready to see something worth stopping for, a fight, maybe, or a deal gone wrong. Instead, she saw 3 small alien children huddled behind a large waste unit at the edge of the market lane. They were Veyari. Cal had seen images of the species before, but never up close. They were small and delicate-looking, with silver skin that caught the light in odd ways and large luminous eyes the color of pale moons. The 3 of them were pressed together like they were trying to keep each other warm. Their clothes were torn and dirty. Their arms were thin in a way that made Cal's stomach feel heavy. A merchant nearby noticed Cal looking and waved a hand in the children's direction like he was shooing away a stray animal. Another vendor on the opposite side simply turned his back. No one stopped. No one even slowed down. Cal stood there for a moment. He looked at the children. He looked at the vendors who were ignoring them. He looked at the rest of the busy market going about its business as if 3 hungry kids were not sitting right there in the dirt. Lena watched him. She already knew what was coming. Cal walked to the nearest food stall, pointed at 3 of the biggest portions on the menu, paid without asking the price, and carried the food back to where the children were sitting. He did not make a big show of it. He did not call out to anyone or look for a reaction. He just sat down on the dirty ground beside the waste unit, set the food in front of the children, and waited. The 3 of them stared at him. They were frightened. Humans were rare this far out in neutral space, and Cal was large by any standard. For a long moment, none of them moved. He stayed still. He kept his hands open and visible. He did not rush. Slowly, the smallest one reached out and took a piece of food. Then the others followed. They ate fast and quietly, and Cal just sat there with them while they did. Through broken translator tech clipped to his jacket, he managed to learn their names over the next few minutes. The oldest was called Ziv. The middle one was Aura. The smallest, who had reached out first, was called Pip. Pip looked up at him once between bites with those pale moon eyes, and Cal gave a small nod like they had just made a deal. By the time the food was gone, Lena had crouched down nearby and was watching with her arms resting on her knees. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say, really. Cal talked to the children through the translator. It was slow and clunky, but he got the shape of it soon enough. Their mother, Sail, had been taken. A group called the Keth Syndicate had come for an old debt. She had been dragged away 2 days ago, and the children had been on their own ever since, too afraid to move and not knowing where to go. Cal listened to all of it. Then he was quiet for a moment. Lena looked at him sideways. She said nothing, but her expression said everything. Cal stood up, brushed off his pants, and looked down at Ziv, Aura, and Pip. He said he was going to find their mother. He said it the same way he might say he was going to check on the cargo, like it was simply the next thing that needed doing. From the upper level of the market, a tall figure in dark armor watched through the shadows. The figure was still for a long time. Then she lifted a small communication device and spoke into it quietly, in words too soft for anyone nearby to catch. Down below, Cal Durham was already asking questions about the Keth Syndicate. Everyone on Waypoint 7 knew about the Keth Syndicate. The problem was that everyone who knew about them also knew better than to get involved with them. The syndicate ran debt contracts across a dozen systems. They were not violent in the flashy, dramatic way that made good stories. They were violent in the quiet, efficient way that made people disappear without a lot of noise. Cal Durham asked about them anyway. The first 3 people he talked to each said the same thing in different ways. Walk away, forget it, not your problem. A dock worker who had been on Waypoint 7 for 20 years told him flat out that the Keth Syndicate had taken smarter people than him and that none of those people had come back looking very happy. Lena stood beside Cal during this conversation and made a face that suggested she agreed with the dock worker. Cal thanked the man and kept walking. He found the syndicate's local contact through a chain of 3 uncomfortable conversations and one very overpriced drink that he barely touched. The contact gave him a name, Vorak. Vorak handled the debt contracts in this sector and worked out of a rented office space on the middle level of the outpost. Cal went to see him. Vorak was a large reptilian alien with flat yellow eyes and the kind of easy confidence that came from being the most dangerous thing in most rooms he walked into. His office smelled like something chemical that Cal could not identify. 2 guards stood near the door. Cal sat down across from Vorak without being invited and put his earnings from the last cargo job on the table. It was a good sum for a man in his line of work. It was not a small offer. He said he wanted to buy the debt contract of a Veyari woman named Sail. He said it calmly and directly, without threats or performance. Just a transaction, if Vorak was willing. Vorak looked at the money. Then he looked at Cal, then he laughed, a low, rough sound that seemed to entertain the guards as well. He told Cal the money was less than a third of what the contract was worth. He told Cal that Veyari labor contracts were not sold to random cargo haulers who wandered in off the dock. Then he had Cal thrown out. Cal landed on the walkway outside the office and sat there for a moment with a bruised shoulder and a bruised sense of reasonable expectations. Lena helped him up and said she had a few ideas, but that none of them were safe and at least one of them was probably illegal in this sector. Cal said that was fine and asked her to explain. What followed over the next 6 hours was not a heroic rescue in any traditional sense. There were no dramatic fights, no speeches, no last-minute explosions. What there was instead was Lena sitting cross-legged on the floor of their ship with a portable terminal, carefully working through the outpost's cargo routing system while Cal talked her through the logistical side of things in a low voice. The Keth Syndicate kept their contract workers in a transit detention hold on the outpost's lower level. The hold was accessed through a cargo corridor that connected to an automated freight system. Cal knew freight systems. He had spent 15 years learning exactly how they worked and where they had gaps. They found the gap. At the right time, the automated system rerouted a large shipment through a section of the lower corridor that was normally clear. This caused a noise complaint that pulled 2 of the hold's external guards to investigate. While they were gone, Cal walked through a side access point that should have required a different passcode but had not been updated in what appeared to be several years. He found Sail in a holding room with 4 other workers. She was thin and tired-looking but not hurt. When she saw the children's names on his translator screen, he had typed them out ahead of time. Her face broke open entirely. Cal helped her move fast and quiet through the freight corridor and into a secondary dock where Lena had already brought the ship around. They were off the docking clamps and into open space before the syndicate knew anything was wrong. The reunion between Sail and her children happened in the small common area of Cal's ship. Ziv held her and would not let go. Aura pressed her face into Sail's side and stayed there. Pip climbed directly into her arms and held on with both hands. Cal stood in the doorway to the cockpit and looked at the far wall. Lena stood next to him and also looked at the far wall. Neither of them spoke for a while. Later, after Sail had eaten and the children were asleep, she came to find Cal in the cockpit. She held something out to him, a small token, silver, about the size of a coin, with a pattern on it that he did not recognize. She pressed it into his hand and said something through the translator that came out as something close to, "What I owe cannot be held in anything, but this must go with you." Cal assumed it was a personal keepsake and thanked her sincerely. He put it in his jacket pocket. He arranged passage for Sail and her children to a safe Veyari settlement 2 systems away, paid the transport fee himself, and watched their ship disappear into the dark. Then he went to sleep for the first time in 30 hours. Lena stayed awake long enough to look up the silver token on the ship's database. It took the system a while. Then the result came back and Lena sat very still for a long moment staring at the screen. She got up and walked to Cal's bunk room and knocked on the door. "Cal," she said, "do you know what this is?" Cal Durham did not panic easily. It was one of his better qualities. He had once kept a clear head when a cargo clamp failed at high altitude, and he had spent 11 minutes in emergency protocol before the backup system caught. He had handled docking disputes, equipment failures, and one particularly bad customs inspection on a frontier station where the officer had clearly not slept in 2 days. But when Lena explained what the silver token was, he sat very still for a while and stared at it in his open hand. The mark of imperial debt. That was what the database called it. In Veyari culture, the item was deeply old and deeply serious. When a member of the Empress's personal household owed a life debt to someone outside the Empire, that person was given the mark. The holder of the mark was then summoned to the Imperial Court for formal recognition. The key part, the part that made Lena's voice go slightly careful when she explained it, was that ignoring the summons was considered an act of war. Not symbolic war. Actual war. Cal looked at the token. He looked at Lena. He looked at the token again. Then he got up, poured a cup of coffee from the machine by the navigation console, the machine that made coffee that tasted like hot sadness but was better than nothing, and drank about half of it standing up. "Well," he said, "that's inconvenient." Lena said she was very glad he was taking this so calmly. They had approximately 4 hours to decide what to do, as it turned out. Because at the end of those 4 hours, the mule dropped out of a routine slipspace transit and found itself sitting in open space directly in front of the largest ship Cal had ever seen in his life. The Veyari imperial vessel hung in the dark like something from a different category of existence. It was luminous, not glowing exactly, but lit from within in a way that made it look alive. It was easily 40 times the length of the mule, which suddenly felt very small and very old. Several smaller escort ships circled it at distances that still dwarfed anything in the human colonial fleet. A voice came through the comm in clean, translated standard language. It was polite and precise and left no real room for negotiation. Cal Durham, holder of the imperial debt mark, was requested aboard the vessel. The word "requested" was doing a lot of work in that sentence. Lena looked at Cal. Cal finished his coffee. "I'm going to need a change of clothes," he said. They were escorted aboard with a ceremony that neither of them had any idea how to respond to. The shuttle bay of the Imperial vessel alone was larger than Waypoint 7's entire lower deck. The Veyari crew who received them were tall and silver-skinned and moved with a particular kind of quiet efficiency that came from doing a job for a very long time. The inside of the ship was extraordinary. Lena, who almost never showed awe at anything, went completely silent. The corridors were wide and lit with a cool, soft light. The materials were unlike anything in human construction, smooth and slightly warm to the touch, shaped in curves that seemed to have been grown rather than built. Cal was cleaned up, given clothes that fit him better than anything he owned, and briefed by a senior court official on exactly what was going to happen next. The briefing included a scripted set of words he was meant to say when he met the Empress. He read through them once and set the paper down. The official looked worried. Cal told him he appreciated the effort. Then the doors opened and he walked into the Empress's receiving hall. Empress Veilen was not what Cal had expected, though he was not entirely sure what he had expected. She was tall, taller than most of the court around her, and had silver-white hair that moved as if it had a slow current running through it. Her eyes were ancient in a way that was hard to explain. They had the kind of depth that made you aware, somewhere in the back of your mind, that she had been watching the galaxy longer than your entire civilization had known about it. The court was silent. Every official and attendant in the room had gone perfectly still. Veilen stepped down from the raised platform where her throne sat and walked directly to Cal, not toward the center of the room to receive him at a formal distance. Directly to him. Her advisor's discomfort was visible even to Cal, who did not know the specific protocols he was watching get ignored. She thanked him in formal Veyari terms that the translator rendered into measured, careful language. Cal listened to all of it. Then he said, in plain words and without using any part of the script, those kids were hungry. Sale needed to get back to them. It wasn't complicated. The court was very quiet. Veilen looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted in her expression. Small, But there. She asked him the question directly, "Why did you do it?" Cal thought about it honestly. Not performing thought, actually thinking. "Because nobody else was going to," he said. The silence in the hall stretched out long enough that Cal briefly wondered if he had accidentally said something offensive in translation. Then Veilen dismissed the court with a single gesture and asked Cal to walk with her. In the doorway behind him, Elder Soren, the oldest of the Empress's senior advisors, small and white-haired and apparently unmovable, watched Cal Durham follow the Empress out of the hall. His expression was complicated. It was the expression of someone who recognized that something had just begun and was not yet certain whether it was good news or bad news, or simply the kind of news that changed everything regardless of how you felt about it. The imperial gardens aboard the vessel were not what the word garden usually meant. There were no flower beds or trimmed hedges. Instead, tall pale trees grew in open arches from a floor of living silver moss, and light moved through the space in long slow patterns like something breathing. It was quiet in a way that felt intentional, like the room had been built around the idea of quiet. Veilen walked without rushing. Cal walked beside her, not behind her, because she had positioned it that way and he had simply followed. She asked him about humans first. Not political questions, personal ones. What did humans fight for, she wanted to know. What did they believe was worth protecting? Cal answered honestly, which meant his answers were neither clean nor comfortable. He told her humans were capable of extraordinary kindness and extraordinary cruelty, often in the same generation, sometimes in the same person. He told her that a lot of human history was people doing terrible things and then eventually, slowly, deciding to do better. He told her that some of them kept trying even when it was not working. She listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she told him something that she had clearly not planned to tell him, or at least not this quickly. The Veyari Imperium was fracturing from the inside. 3 noble houses, powerful old families who had held influence for centuries, were moving their pieces into position. Veilen had no heir and had not chosen one. The noble houses were not waiting any longer. Each of them believed they could control whoever sat on the throne next, and each of them was right that the others could not be allowed to. The empire was balanced on a very sharp point, and it had been balanced there for a long time. Cal listened to all of this and then said, "Why are you telling me this?" Veilen was quiet for a moment. They traveled to Velora Prime the next morning. The Veyari homeworld was the kind of place that made a person feel small in a way that was not unpleasant. Silver forests that stretched to the horizon, cities that floated at the level of the clouds and caught the light like cut glass, water that ran in slow rivers through stone channels carved so long ago that no one still living remembered who had done the carving. Lena was given comfortable quarters and access to the parts of the palace that were considered public. She spent most of this time composing increasingly alarmed messages to the Human Colonial Authority. The Human Colonial Authority, for its part, seemed to be having some trouble processing the situation. On the second evening on Velora Prime, Veilen asked Cal to meet her in the private receiving garden behind the main palace hall. He went alone. She was already there when he arrived, standing at the edge of a long reflective pool that showed the stars. She spoke without turning around at first. She told him the rest of it. In Veyari law, ancient law, older than the current empire, the Empress's chosen consort was not required to come from the noble houses. The law had been written that way deliberately, by an Empress who had lived long enough to distrust inherited power. The consort had to be someone of proven character. Someone who had demonstrated, in visible and unambiguous terms, that they acted from something other than self-interest. Veilen turned and looked at him. She wanted him to become her imperial consort. Not as a decoration or a symbol. As a genuine bond, in Veyari terms, a mate. The consort's role carried real weight in the imperial court. It was not a quiet position. It would not be a simple life. Cal was quiet for long enough that a lesser person might have filled the silence. Veilen did not. Finally he said, "I need to think about it." She nodded once, as if this was the only answer she would have respected. Cal went and found Lena and told her. Lena's response was to be silent for an unusually long time, long enough that Cal checked to make sure the comm was still connected. Then she said, in a very measured voice, that he had got to be kidding her. He was not kidding her. Cal sat alone for a long time that night. He thought about his ship, which was old and comfortable, and his. He thought about his route, which was simple and honest work. He thought about what his life looked like from the outside, which was not a thing he usually spent much time on. And then he thought about Ziv, Aura, and Pip. About how Pip had reached for the food first, even while still scared. About Sail pressing the token into his hand in the dark with tears on her face. About how nobody at that market had stopped. Nobody except him, and that had only been because he happened to be walking by. What would it mean to have a human voice, a real one, with weight behind it, at the highest table in the galaxy? Not a political voice. Not a diplomat's voice. Just a person who thought that if someone was hungry, you fed them, and if someone needed to get home, you helped them get there. Elder Soren visited him near midnight. The old advisor sat across from him in the small guest room and folded his long hands together and looked at Cal for a moment before speaking. He told Cal plainly that accepting would make enemies. The noble houses would see a human consort as a provocation. They would see humans as an emerging power with access to the imperial throne, and they would act accordingly. Cal's life, Soren said, would never be uncomplicated again. Cal asked him what Veilen was like. Not as Empress. As a person. Soren was quiet for a long time. Then he said, slowly, "She has been alone at the top of everything for a very long time. I think, perhaps, she is tired of it." Cal nodded slowly and looked at the wall. The next morning he went to find Veilen in the Silver Gardens where, Soren had mentioned once in passing, she went alone at night when the court was sleeping. She was there. She turned when she heard him coming, and for just a fraction of a moment, before the composure came back into place, she looked uncertain. Maybe even a little afraid of the answer. Cal said, "I've got a condition or two, if you're willing to hear them." Veilen's advisors had prepared for a great many possible versions of this conversation. They had drafted responses to political demands, to requests for territory or trade rights, to the kind of sweeping ambitions that someone with sudden access to enormous power might try to stake a claim on. What they had not prepared for was Cal Durham. His first condition: he was not giving up his ship or his work entirely. He was a cargo hauler. That was not a cover story or a phase in his life. It was what he did, and he intended to keep doing at least some of it. Veilen's senior advisor made a sound that was not quite a word. His second condition: any formal arrangement between himself and the Veyari Imperium had to come with real protections for human independent operators working in galactic space. They were small players in a big system, and they kept getting squeezed by larger powers who did not take them seriously. That needed to change. His third condition: the Veyari Imperium would open full diplomatic contact with the human colonial authority. Not as a courtesy. Not as a footnote. As equals at the table. The room was very quiet at this point. Several advisors were looking at each other. His fourth and final condition, the personal one: Ziv, Aura, and Pip were to be given a proper home and a proper education under imperial care. Not a favor. Written into the arrangement as a formal guarantee. Veilen listened to each condition without expression. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said she agreed to all four. She had one counter-condition, and she stated it quietly and privately, and whatever it was, it made Cal go still for several seconds before he nodded. Elder Soren, watching from the corner of the room, allowed himself a very small smile. The announcement went out through official imperial channels the following morning. By midday, the galactic communication networks were in a state that could only be described as chaotic. A human cargo hauler, an independent operator from the Kentucky region of a mid-tier colonial world, had been named imperial consort of the Veyari Empire. The three noble houses responded with formal letters of objection that were perfectly worded and completely legally useless. The ancient law was clear. They had no ground to stand on, and they knew it, and the fact that they knew it did not improve their moods at all. At the Human Colonial Authority's main office, a mid-level administrator named Greg Holly received the official diplomatic communique from the Veyari Imperium and read it 3 times without moving. Then he called his assistant Diane into his office and asked her to read it and confirm that he was reading it correctly. Diane read it. Then she sat down without being offered a chair and stared at the wall for a moment. Greg Holly sent 5 separate messages to his supervisors over the course of the afternoon. None of them received useful replies. He eventually framed the communique and put it on his wall, because he could not think of what else to do with it. Lena Price was interviewed by reporters from 17 different galactic news services in the first 2 days after the announcement. She gave each of them a different account of the events. One outlet reported that Cal had fought off a group of syndicate enforcers single-handed. Another reported that the Empress had been observing him from a distance for years. A third reported that the whole thing had started when Cal had challenged Vorak to some kind of formal contest. Lena found this extremely entertaining. The bonding ceremony was held in the main hall of the Imperial Palace on Velora Prime. Cal had asked for it to be small, and it was small by Imperial standards, which still meant roughly 300 people. Sale was there with Ziv, Aura, and Pip. Pip fell asleep during the middle section of the ceremony, curled up with one cheek resting on Cal's boot. Nobody moved him. When it was Cal's turn to speak the Veyari bonding words, he spoke them in Veyari. His pronunciation was careful and clearly practiced, the words of someone who had spent a significant number of hours getting this right because he wanted to get it right. He did not rush them. He did not stumble. Veilen's composure held through the full ceremony except for one moment, which was that moment. Her expression shifted in a way that was small and quiet and real, and anyone who was watching closely enough saw it. Elder Soren was watching closely enough. 6 weeks later, the mule was drifting through open space on a standard supply run in the outer colonial belt. Cal sat at the controls the way he always had, relaxed, one hand resting on the console, watching the dark. The new co-pilot, a young man named Pete, was running the navigation check on the other side of the cockpit. Lena Price was no longer co-pilot. She had accepted a position as the first human trade liaison to the Veyari Imperial Court, which was a job that had not existed before Cal created the conditions for it to exist. She was, by all accounts, very good at it and extremely difficult to argue with. The comm opened. Veilen's voice came through. She was managing a council session and sounded like someone who had been managing a council session for too long. She said 3 things she needed to brief him on before the next time he was in range of the palace. Cal listened to the first one and then said, "Have you eaten today?" A pause. "You are not going to ask an empress whether she has eaten," she said. "I just did," Cal said. Another pause. Longer this time. Then, very quietly, there was a sound from the comm that might have been a laugh, small and brief and real, before the line clicked off. Cal leaned back in his seat. Pete was pretending very hard to be focused on the navigation check. Outside the window, the stars stretched out in every direction, the same stars that had always been there, over every world Cal had ever passed through. They looked the same as they always had. But something about the space between them felt different now. Fuller, maybe. More connected. He thought about a dirty outpost floor. About 3 small children pressed together behind a waste unit. About how he had not planned anything that day. Had not been looking for something to do or someone to help. He just could not walk past them. He never really could.